The body had no head. It was found in a swamp near Bucharest in 1476, armored, butchered, and barely recognizable. The head, severed cleanly at the neck, had already been sent to Constantinople, preserved in honey, and delivered as proof. Sultan Mehmed II had it displayed on a spike above the city gates. The corpse belonged to Vlad III, former voivode of Wallachia. Known across Europe as Vlad the Impaler, he had ruled through fear, cruelty, and calculated violence. His final days were chaotic, a failed campaign, ambushed by rivals, betrayed by former allies. He died either on the battlefield or by assassination. The exact details remain disputed. What was not disputed was the body count he left behind. Estimates range into the tens of thousands. Entire villages impaled on stakes, bodies left rotting in forests and fields, executions by fire, dismemberment, boiling, skinning. These were not isolated acts, but state policy. He was not mad. He was not myth. He was a ruler in a brutal age, and his methods were deliberate. He didn't begin as a tyrant, just a hostage, and a son with a name not yet feared. Vlad III was born in 1431 in the fortified town of Sighișoara, in the region of Transylvania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary. He was the second legitimate son of Vlad II Dracul, a member of the House of Draculesti, a branch of the ruling Basarab dynasty of Wallachia. His father, Vlad II, had recently been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a militant Christian order founded to defend Europe against the Ottoman Empire. The word Dracul, meaning dragon in Latin, would later be passed down to his son. Vlad III would become known as Dracula, or Son of the Dragon. Wallachia at the time was a volatile frontier state, squeezed between two major powers, the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the northwest. Control over the region was constantly contested through war, shifting alliances, and assassination. No ruler lasted long. Vlad's early life was shaped by this instability. In 1442, his father was summoned by the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, who demanded hostages to ensure loyalty. Vlad III, just around age 11, and his younger brother Radu were taken to the Ottoman court. Vlad would spend years there, educated in warfare, religion, and governance, but under guard, with escape, punishable by death. These early years created a hard divide. Radu adapted, grew close to the Ottomans, and eventually converted to Islam. Vlad did not. He grew bitter, mistrustful, and absorbed both the cruelty and efficiency of his captors. He learned discipline. He learned diplomacy. But he also learned terror. By the time he was released, Vlad had already seen executions, betrayals, and public floggings ordered with absolute authority. He returned to a homeland in chaos, his father murdered by local rivals, and his older brother buried alive by boyars. He came back not as a prince, but as a survivor. But this early promise would later give way to violence and control. Vlad III's formative years were spent under Ottoman custody at Edirne, the imperial capital. He was not mistreated, but neither was he free. The Sultan kept noble hostages like him to ensure political compliance from their families. It was a system of political grooming, with rigid control and structured education. He was taught to ride, hunt, command, and speak Turkish and Arabic. He read classical literature and learned Islamic law and administration. The Ottomans believed in shaping future leaders, even enemies, through exposure to the empire's strength and discipline. Vlad learned how authority functioned at scale. He also witnessed executions, floggings, and mutilations carried out in public, designed to deter rebellion through shock. He did not forget it. Meanwhile, his younger brother Radu adapted willingly, gaining favor with Sultan Murad II and his son Mehmed, the future conqueror of Constantinople. Radu's compliance earned him safety. Vlad's defiance earned him isolation. When news came that his father and older brother had been murdered by Wallachian nobles, something changed. His father, Vlad II, had been ousted and killed by the same boyars he had once tried to appease. His brother Mircea was tortured and buried alive. Their deaths were the result of betrayal, not war. This lesson became foundational. Power, Vlad concluded, could not be shared. Treachery came not from foreigners, but from within. When released by the Ottomans around 1448, Vlad returned to a fractured homeland. He was supported briefly by the Turks to reclaim his father's throne, but was quickly forced out. For the next several years, he lived in exile, moving between Moldavia, Transylvania, and Hungary, seeking allies, learning court politics, and watching how power was gained and lost. During this period, he formed a hardened worldview. Enemies must be eliminated, not negotiated with. Institutions could not be trusted. Violence, if used precisely and without hesitation, could serve as both punishment and deterrent. He became obsessed with the idea of restoring order through terror, not as chaos, but as system. These beliefs were not abstract. They had been carved into him by captivity, betrayal, and survival. Soon, those ideas would be put to the test, not in theory, but in power. Vlad III first took the throne of Wallachia in October 1448, briefly, and under Ottoman support. His initial rule lasted less than 2 months. He was driven out almost immediately by Hungarian-backed rivals, and he disappeared into exile. It would take 7 years for him to return. By 1456, the political landscape had shifted. The Ottomans had taken Constantinople, and the Kingdom of Hungary, now under John Hunyadi, was desperate to secure its eastern flank. Vlad re-emerged with Hungarian backing and seized power by military force. His main rival, Vladislav II, was killed, either in battle or by assassination. Vlad then established himself as voivode once more. This time, he was prepared. Almost immediately, he began consolidating power by removing internal threats. In 1457, he invited hundreds of boyars, the same class who had betrayed his father, to a banquet in Targovishte. Once they had eaten, his soldiers arrested them. Some were impaled on the spot. Others were forced into forced labor, marched to rebuild his fortress at Poenari, often with chains around their necks. The message was unambiguous. Loyalty was no longer optional. In the years that followed, Vlad established a brutal form of governance built around public terror. Crime, corruption, and dissent were punished with swift and extreme violence. Thieves were impaled in the town square. Dishonest merchants were boiled alive. Local leaders suspected of plotting against him were beheaded, burned, or buried alive. He used fear not just as punishment, but as prevention. Reports circulated of entire villages wiped out, forests filled with impaled corpses. A famous account told of a golden cup left in a public square never stolen, because people feared the punishment. Vlad's policies were not haphazard. They were designed to instill absolute obedience, and they worked, at least temporarily. Trade resumed, roads were safer, order returned. But it came at a cost. Neighboring rulers began to take notice. The Ottomans saw a former puppet turning defiant. The Hungarian court, while pleased at the weakening of Turkish influence, grew uneasy about the methods. Now in power, Vlad began turning belief into law into control. By the early 1460s, Vlad III had transformed Wallachia into a controlled, militarized principality ruled by fear. But outside his borders, pressure was building. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Mehmed II, expected continued obedience. Vlad had once paid tribute. Now, he refused. In 1461, Ottoman envoys were sent to negotiate. Vlad received them in Targovishte, had them killed. Some were reportedly nailed to their turbans, their skulls split for refusing to remove their headwear in his presence. It was both symbolic and final. He then invaded Ottoman territory, conducting a series of brutal raids across the Danube. Entire villages were massacred. Ottoman garrisons were destroyed. Thousands of captives were impaled and left behind as warnings. Vlad's letters to European allies described it all in precise, clinical terms. He wanted his actions known, but retaliation came quickly. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II launched a massive military campaign against him. With an army of over 90,000 men, Vlad could not meet such a force in open battle, so he used scorched earth tactics, poisoning wells, burning crops, and attacking supply lines. Then came the most infamous event of his reign, the Forest of the Impale. As the Ottomans approached Targovishte, they encountered a field of over 20,000 impaled corpses, men, women, and children, left to rot. The smell and horror reportedly stunned the advancing army. Sultan Mehmed entered the city but soon withdrew, disturbed by the psychological warfare and logistical chaos. Yet despite this temporary success, Vlad's position was weakening. Inside Wallachia, nobles and peasants were exhausted. His tactics had secured fear, not loyalty. Worse, his own brother Radu the Fair, now aligned with the Ottomans, launched a rival claim to the throne. Many Wallachians defected. By late 1462, Vlad fled toward Hungary to seek support. Instead, he was arrested by King Matthias Corvinus, who needed a diplomatic excuse to avoid war with the Ottomans. Vlad was imprisoned in Hungary for over a decade. During that time, Radu ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman vassal. Vlad's ideology, absolute control, enforced through public terror, had clashed with the limits of reality. His enemies were multiplying, and his grip had slipped. But not everyone stayed silent. Powerful factions still remembered his earlier order and wanted it back. Vlad would return. When Vlad III regained the throne in 1476, it was under drastically different circumstances. He had been released from captivity in Hungary and backed by King Matthias Corvinus, who now saw strategic value in Vlad as a bulwark against Ottoman expansion. But the kingdom he returned to was fractured, tired, and barely under his control. Vlad's response was immediate. He reinstated the machinery of terror. There were no formal institutions, no secret police or codified law enforcement. Instead, punishment itself was the system. He relied on personal guards and loyal soldiers, empowered to act without legal restraint. Judgments were issued directly, often publicly. Justice was not blind. It was brutal and visible. Impalement remained the core method. A sharpened wooden stake was driven through the body, often from anus or groin to shoulder or mouth, avoiding vital organs to prolong death. Victims could live for hours or days. These executions were carried out en masse. Hillsides, roads, and forests were lined with the dead and dying, forming corridors of warning. Other punishments included decapitation, flaying, boiling, and dismemberment. Entire communities suspected of disloyalty were destroyed. In one campaign, Vlad had hundreds of Saxon merchants from Transylvanian towns impaled for economic disobedience. Their heads were sent back to their cities in crates. These acts were not random. Vlad targeted the boyars, whom he viewed as inherently treacherous, and enforced total obedience among the peasantry, ensuring they reported crimes or became complicit through silence. In villages, collective punishment was used. If a theft occurred, everyone could be punished unless the thief was identified. Terror extended beyond class and into everyday life. It is said Vlad had cauldrons placed in public squares where water boiled, not for use, but for demonstration. He reportedly punished adulterers, beggars, and liars with the same finality he applied to spies and traitors. No distinction was made between moral failure and political danger. There was no appeal. There were no second chances. Over time, a culture of fear developed. People watched their neighbors. Doms grew silent. Hospitality, honesty, and compliance became survival strategies. Even foreign observers took note. Emissaries from Venice and Hungary described Wallachia under Vlad as orderly, but deadened, grim, and patrolled by dread. The effect was not lost on his enemies. Few dared open rebellion. Even fewer tried to assassinate him. His reputation became armor. But fear was not selective. Even individuals close to Vlad were targeted by these systems. By his final reign in 1476, Vlad III trusted almost no one. The years in exile, imprisonment, and betrayal had sharpened his paranoia. His earlier experiences, his father's murder, his brother's defection, and the defiance of boyars, left deep and lasting scars. Power had become survival, and survival demanded the elimination of all doubt. Even his inner circle was not immune. Loyalists from his previous reigns were interrogated and in some cases executed without formal accusation. Servants disappeared. Courtiers were replaced frequently, often with those of low status who depended entirely on Vlad's favor. Competence mattered less than obedience. Family was no refuge. His younger brother Radu, once his closest companion in Ottoman captivity, was now his most immediate rival. Backed by the Ottomans, installed as voivode in his absence, and still a potent threat, Vlad referred to Radu as the Turk's dog, and in later campaigns he executed nobles merely suspected of having supported Radu during Vlad's time in prison. There is no surviving evidence of any attempt to reconcile. Marital records suggest that Vlad remarried during his Hungarian captivity, taking a noblewoman possibly related to King Matthias Corvinus, but no letters or accounts suggest emotional closeness. Their union appears to have been political. She does not reappear in the record after his return to Wallachia. By this point, ideological loyalty had displaced all personal bonds. His worldview no longer allowed for ambiguity. Suspicion equaled guilt. Hesitation equaled betrayal. In private councils, he listened more and spoke less. His orders were increasingly handed down through intermediaries. His presence became both feared and rare. Letters from his final year show a growing obsession with moral decay and treachery. He accused merchants of sabotaging trade, monks of corruption, nobles of cowardice. No offense was too small to trigger reprisal. One chronicler wrote that he judged men not by their actions, but by what he imagined they might do. The courts, the church, and his own retainers began to walk cautiously, offering gestures of loyalty that were neither trusted nor rewarded. It was not just a political climate of fear, it was a personal reality shaped by unrelenting isolation. No one was too close. No one was safe. Signs of strain in leadership and personal stability were now evident. By late 1476, observers noted visible changes in Vlad III's appearance and behavior. Though no official physician records survive, reports from diplomats and chroniclers provide a partial account. They describe a man whose body was worn and whose routines had narrowed into obsession. His face had grown gaunt. He reportedly suffered from chronic fatigue and recurring fever. His speech, once sharp and calculated, became erratic in some settings, ranging from long silences to sudden, repetitive commands. His eyes, noted by multiple foreign envoys, had taken on a fixed, unblinking intensity. Those close to his court described long hours spent alone, and a growing preoccupation with rituals of cleanliness and control. Food tasters were required for every meal. Entry to his chambers was limited and tightly guarded. Even his handwriting, once crisp, began to show tremors in surviving documents, uneven, hesitant, less consistent than in earlier years. Some historians have speculated about chronic illnesses such as malaria, syphilis, or even lead poisoning from contaminated water supplies. Others point to the psychological toll of his lifetime. Captivity as a child, family betrayal, prolonged warfare, and imprisonment. What is not in dispute is that his health was declining, and his ability to tolerate dissent, ambiguity, or opposition was vanishing. Accounts from Saxon merchants and Hungarian agents note that Vlad had become increasingly volatile, sometimes changing orders within the same day, issuing contradictory commands, or abandoning meetings halfway through. Punishments grew more extreme and less connected to policy. One village was reportedly razed for failing to deliver grain on time. A local priest was flayed for suggesting the prince rest during Lent. There were also signs of hallucination or delusion. One report claims that Vlad spoke to absent advisors, gave orders to long-dead guards, and insisted that Ottoman spies were disguising themselves as animals. While some of these accounts may be exaggerations intended to discredit him, they were repeated in multiple regions, suggesting a broader perception of instability. Despite all of this, Vlad retained full command of his military, and his troops continued to follow him. Discipline within his forces remained strict. His enemies feared him as much as ever, but within the walls of his court, whispers of deterioration spread. Councillors spoke in lowered voices. Ambassadors from Hungary and Venice noted the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer orderly terror, but unpredictable madness. Each new episode of pain, confusion, or rage echoed the cruelties of his past. The ruler who had used fear to dominate now seemed governed by it. Despite worsening health, Vlad retained control over key decisions. There was no long deathbed, no final speech, no chamber of mourners. Vlad III died on the road, somewhere near Snagov or Bucharest, in late December 1476, during a military campaign. The exact circumstances remain unclear. One account claims he was ambushed by Ottoman agents, cut down in battle as he moved with a small contingent of troops. Another says he was mistaken for an enemy by his own men during a chaotic skirmish. A third suggests assassination by Wallachian boyars who had quietly realigned themselves with his brother's supporters. All agree on one detail: his head was removed. Ottoman soldiers reportedly found his corpse, decapitated it, and preserved the head in honey before sending it to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople. There, it was mounted on a spike, publicly displayed at the city gates, as proof that the man known as Vlad Dracula was dead. In the weeks before his death, Vlad had issued a series of final orders. One was a decree reinforcing death penalties for theft and hoarding. Another demanded the mass conscription of peasants for road building, despite winter conditions and failing supplies. There is no record of a will, no letters of farewell. The only personal document that survives from his final weeks is a curt communication to Hungarian authorities, requesting military support and warning of internal betrayal. It ends with a phrase he had used many times before: "I will do what must be done." His body was buried, most likely, at the monastery at Snagov, though no marked grave remains. When archaeologists excavated the site centuries later, they found no confirmed remains. The absence has only deepened the myths. There were no rituals, no royal funeral, no ceremony of succession, just silence and a power vacuum. Vlad's death, though violent, was not exceptional in Wallachia's history. What was exceptional was the aura of fear that lingered long after the body fell. Few rulers left so many corpses and so little certainty. Vlad III died in the cold, surrounded by enemies and shadows. He left behind no heir strong enough to claim his legacy. Vlad died in 1476. Power was immediately contested. With Vlad III's death in late 1476, Wallachia descended into uncertainty. There was no clear successor. His young son, Minia, was too minor to claim the throne and had no meaningful support. The nobles who had once feared Vlad's punishments quickly reasserted themselves, forming unstable alliances and shifting loyalties based on external influence. Within weeks, Radu the Fair, Vlad's younger brother and former rival, was reinstated by the Ottomans. He ruled as a vassal prince, more compliant and politically flexible, offering tribute and safe passage to Ottoman envoys. For the Sultan, Radu was easier to control. For the boyars, he was more predictable. The policies of terror Vlad had enforced were immediately rolled back. Mass executions stopped. The forests of stakes were cleared. Trade reopened under less brutal oversight. Foreign merchants returned cautiously. Wallachia resumed its role as a contested buffer state between empires. But the scars remained. In many regions, order quickly collapsed. Peasants who had once feared the consequences of disobedience stopped paying taxes. banditry returned to the roads. Nobles resumed their old rivalries, each hoping to claim greater land or influence under the new regime. Meanwhile, Hungary and the Ottoman Empire both sought to shape Wallachhia's next phase. The territory's value was not its resources, but its position, a corridor between East and West. Vlad's death removed the one figure who had governed with both independence and brutality, leaving only fragments behind. A series of short-lived rulers followed in the next 2 decades. Few lasted more than a year or two. Many were imposed by foreign courts. None possessed the absolute grip that Vlad had maintained. The principality remained technically autonomous, but real power shifted back and forth across its borders. Vlad's reforms, his attempts at centralized authority, economic control, and military independence, dissolved almost immediately. His vision had been built on personal fear. Without him, there was no system left to enforce it. His enemies outlived him. His policies did not. The historical record of Vlad began to evolve immediately. After his death, the image of Vlad III fractured into contradictory narratives. In Ottoman accounts, he remained a villain, cruel, treacherous, and unstable. Chronicles from Constantinople emphasized his massacres, his defiance of diplomatic norms, and his use of impalement as policy. They presented him as a cautionary example of Christian brutality and disorder. In Western Europe, especially in the Holy Roman Empire and Italy, he was described in more complex terms. Some early pamphlets circulated stories of extreme cruelty, often exaggerated, claiming that Vlad dined among impaled bodies, boiled children, or nailed hats to heads. These tales were printed and reprinted, becoming early forms of mass propaganda. They portrayed him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, but also as an exotic ruler from the violent fringes of Christendom. Yet in Romanian and Eastern European memory, another version persisted. In Wallachia and parts of Transylvania, oral traditions and local chronicles began to recast Vlad as a just but harsh ruler, a man who had imposed order where none existed. He was remembered for punishing thieves, enforcing strict discipline, and protecting the land from foreign domination. In rural folklore, he became a symbol of national defense against Ottoman expansion. Modern historians remain divided. Some emphasize his tactical brilliance and ability to manipulate larger powers, Hungary, the papacy, the Ottomans, while maintaining a fragile sovereignty. Others focus on the cruelty of his rule, noting that impalement was not incidental but institutional, and that his governance lacked sustainable legal or civic foundations. Medical and psychological analyses in recent decades have speculated on trauma, captivity-induced psychopathy, and potential neurodegenerative disorders. But these remain interpretations, shaped by modern frameworks imposed on a 15th century figure. What's clear is that Vlad the Impaler became a myth, both feared and revered. His deeds were remembered not just for their scale, but for their deliberate visibility. He understood performance. He used terror as a message, one that outlasted his body. And centuries later, fiction took over. By the 19th century, the name Dracula, originally just a patronymic, had been repurposed, stylized, and adapted into vampire legend. The fictional count eclipsed the historical prince, but the real man remains in the record, harsher than the myth, and far more political. Modern historians continue to debate the long-term effects of Vlad's rule. Vlad III left behind no lasting dynasty, no enduring legal code, and no administrative system. His rule did not reshape Wallachia in structure, but it did leave a deep impression in memory, one that outlived his borders and bloodline. His political philosophy was simple and direct: absolute control through absolute fear. In a time when rulers were routinely overthrown by nobles, foreign powers, or their own families, Vlad's model was one of violent deterrence. He treated every challenge as a threat to the state and eliminated it as such. This left a cultural legacy defined less by governance and more by reaction. For generations, Romanian rulers invoked his name during times of disorder, not as a model for policy, but as a reminder that power if unchecked, could become something else entirely. His reign marked one of the most extreme applications of terror as a tool of statecraft in European history. Yet it did not survive him. Without Vlad himself, the system collapsed, revealing how unsustainable power becomes when it is concentrated entirely in one person and enforced through spectacle. Culturally, he remains a paradox. A hero to some, a monster to others, a cautionary figure in both cases. His story, stripped of legend, offers a portrait of leadership at its most stripped down: rule by command, silence, and punishment. There is no evidence Vlad believed in liberty, reform, or law in the modern sense. He believed in order, and he enforced it by making its collapse seem more terrifying than submission. His story endures because it forces confrontation with the mechanics of fear, with the psychology of absolute rule, and with the consequences of power exercised without limit or oversight. In the centuries that followed, institutions evolved, laws deepened, and empires rose and fell. But the core question remains: how far will a leader go to impose control? And how long can such control last before it consumes itself? Vlad III answered that question in stakes and silence. The world around him changed. He did not, and that rigidity, more than any stake or sword, defined the limits of his power and the legacy he could never control.